My name is Nicole Greene, and 20 years ago, my father looked me dead in the eye and delivered a sentence that still scorches my heart. You made your bed. Now lie in it. Those were the final words he ever spoke to me before slamming the door with such force the porch windows rattled, leaving me outside on a freezing November night, trembling, pregnant, and completely unwanted by the family that raised me. I was just 19, scared, alone, carrying a life they all wished didn't exist. The porch light blazed above me like a public execution spotlight. My older brother leaned in the doorway behind Dad, arms crossed, a smug grin spreading across his face like he'd finally won some sick family competition. "Don't come back begging," he tossed out, gleeful. Through the kitchen window, I saw my mother's shadow, her shoulders shaking, her sobs muffled by glass and fear. But she didn't come into me. Either she wasn't allowed, or she chose not to risk his wrath. That was the night I stepped off our porch with nothing but a duffel bag, a racing heartbeat, and the echo of my father's condemnation chasing me into the dark. You have to understand the world I grew up in. A tiny Midwestern town where gossip was the local currency and keeping up appearances was a full-time job. My father, church deacon, pillar of the community, scripture-spitting moral authority, wore his polished suit like a holy shield. But when it came to me, his only daughter, he dropped the mask and showed nothing but cruelty. In his eyes, I hadn't just sinned, I had destroyed him. My brother saw me as the family stain. My father saw me as a threat to his reputation. And suddenly, the girl they raised became someone they erased. I walked the entire length of that gravel driveway, feeling like I'd been exiled from my own life. My first stop was a friend's lumpy couch. I remember lying awake, staring at the ceiling, one hand on my belly, wondering how a terrified teenager was supposed to raise a child alone. I thought about calling Mom, but every time I pictured her picking up, I imagined him grabbing the phone first. "Don't come crawling back," he'd say, and I refused to give him that victory. So I learned how to survive. I scrubbed tables at a diner until my back screamed. I cleaned office floors until my hands cracked from bleach. My feet swelled, my clothes barely fit, but I kept going. I scraped money together for a tiny studio apartment, a peeling, freezing, leaky little box, but it was mine. And inside that tiny space, every flutter from the baby growing inside me whispered, "Don't give up. I'm here." It wasn't me against the world anymore. It was us. I'll never forget one night, December, just days before Christmas. Snow poured down like the sky was collapsing. The neighbor's old car refused to start, so I walked home from the diner, 6 months pregnant, exhausted, my coat straining around my stomach. People rushed past me with shopping bags and holiday cheer. Couples laughed. Families smiled. Not one person looked twice at the struggling girl trudging through the snow, holding her belly as if her child could keep her warm. I sat down on a bus stop bench and cried harder than I ever had before. That was the lowest point. For a split second, I thought maybe Dad was right, that I had made my bed, and misery was all I deserved. But something changed in me that night. A stranger stopped, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes. She didn't ask me why I was crying. She just sat next to me, handed me a thermos of hot tea, and said, "Honey, God never wastes pain." That sentence pierced through the fog. I carried it with me from that day on. I realized I had a choice: either let bitterness define me or fight to build something better. That's when I started looking for a path forward. I applied for community college classes using grants and loans. I signed up for ROTC because they offered scholarships and structure. And frankly, I needed both. At first, it was grueling. My body was already worn down from long shifts and pregnancy. But the discipline, the camaraderie, it gave me a purpose. For the first time since that porch, I felt like I belonged somewhere again. The day I gave birth alone in that dingy apartment, I thought about calling my parents. I thought maybe hearing their grandchild's cry would soften their hearts. But when I held my baby girl, tiny fingers curled tight around mine, I realized I didn't need their approval anymore. I looked down at her and whispered, "We're going to make it. Just you and me." And I meant it with every bone in my body. Those first years weren't glamorous. I juggled diapers, midnight feedings, classes, and part-time jobs. There were nights when I collapsed onto the floor, too tired to crawl into bed. But every challenge hardened me, sharpened me. I became someone my father would never recognize. Someone stronger than his rejection, tougher than his words. The girl he threw out was gone. A new woman was being forged in fire. Looking back now, I see part one of my story not as tragedy, but as the beginning of transformation. It was the shove that forced me to find my own footing. The cut that made the scar. The exile that made the return so powerful. My father thought he had ended my life that night. In truth, he set in motion a story that would one day bring him to his knees. I didn't realize how much a routine could save a person until I built one from scratch. Mornings began with a second-hand coffee maker sputtering to life on my counter. The smell of burnt grounds, mixing with baby powder and bleach. I'd strap my daughter Grace into a thrift store stroller and push her 3 blocks to the woman who watched her while I worked the breakfast shift at the diner. The metal bell over the diner door sang the same tiny note every day. I wiped ketchup rings, refilled coffee for men in camo caps, and learned how to smile at people who never looked up from their newspapers. Community college was a blur of fluorescent lights and cinder-block hallways. I took evening classes, English comp, American history, a public speaking course that terrified me. ROTC met at dawn on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'd drop Grace off before the sun came up, whispering apologies for waking her, then jog to campus with my backpack thumping against my spine. PT was a shock to the system. I was still rebuilding my body after childbirth, and for the first few months, I was always at the back of the formation. But there was a stubbornness inside me my father had misjudged. When my lungs burned, I imagined the porch light on that November night and found another step. There were people who changed my life in small ways. The stranger with the thermos of tea had planted a seed. At the diner, a retired gunnery sergeant named Oliver started tipping me in advice. "Ma'am," he'd say, because he called every woman ma'am, "always lace your boots the same way. Discipline starts where you stand." He'd slide a folded Post-it with a list: push-up progressions, interval runs, how to tape a blister. "You doing ROTC?" he asked one morning. I nodded. "Good," he said. And that was the whole sermon. Later, when I passed my first PT test without vomiting, I left an apple pie on his table, on the house. He tipped me $5 and a grin that lasted all day. Money was a constant knot. I sold plasma twice a month when the February gas bill came with that ugly red stamp. I spent a Tuesday afternoon at the Community Assistance Office, Grace asleep on my chest, listening to a caseworker explain the difference between a handout and a hand up. I learned to stretch a rotisserie chicken across 3 dinners and to sew a missing button with dental floss. I learned what true exhaustion felt like, the kind where you read the same sentence 3 times and still can't remember the words. Church was complicated. Dad's church wasn't my church anymore. But on Sundays, I found a small congregation that met in a repurposed storefront between a laundromat and a payday loan place. No stained glass, just folding chairs and a pastor with a battered guitar. They didn't ask questions when I cried during the second hymn. A woman named Ivy, silver hair pinned in a neat roll, started bringing over casseroles just because. On the nights I thought about calling my mother, I baked cornbread for Ivy and told her, "Thank you too many times." ROTC taught me to hold my head, like it belonged to somebody who mattered. The first time I wore the uniform to campus, I stared at myself in a bathroom mirror and saw a person I didn't recognize. Chin level, shoulders back. The instructors were not sentimental. They cared about checklists and standards, and whether you showed up 5 minutes early. I started craving that certainty. If you did the work, you earned the rank. Nobody could take that from you. I won't pretend I got it all right. I missed Grace's first steps because I stayed late to practice land navigation in a fogged-up classroom. I forgot to sign a daycare permission form and lost our spot for a week. One midnight, walking home with Grace asleep in her stroller, a police cruiser slowed beside me. The officer asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. He didn't believe me. He circled the block twice. I moved faster. When Grace was 3, I applied to an officer accession program that sounded like something meant for other people. People with last names that opened doors. The application asked for an essay on resilience. I wrote about the bench in December, the thermos of tea, and the sentence, "God never wastes pain." I wrote about a deacon who told his daughter she was the shame of the family, and a girl who learned shame could become fuel. I wrote it all out, printed it at the library for 10 cents a page, and slid it into a manila envelope with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The letter came in late spring. Grace was coloring on the floor, the cartoon dog on TV speaking in a voice that made my teeth ache. I opened the envelope and read the word "accepted" 3 times. It wasn't a movie moment. No orchestra swelled. I just sat there, knees pulled up, with that letter pressed to my chest while Grace asked if we could have macaroni for dinner. "We can have anything," I told her. And for once, it felt true. Training was a new kind of hard. I shipped out with a duffel bag and a promise to my daughter that I would be back better. The days stacked up like bricks: reveille, chow, classes, field exercises, more chow, more studying, lights out, repeat. I learned to make my bunk with corners sharp enough to cut. I learned the language of maps, azimuth, contour line, resection. I learned how to count heartbeats in the quiet between orders. When a cadre member barked at me for a mistake, I discovered that I could take the hit, fix the error, and not crumble. There were setbacks. During a ruck march in August, the sky cracked open and dumped water like judgment. My boots sloshed. My socks rubbed my heels raw. I thought about my father with every step, and it didn't hurt. It propelled me. A captain, sharp-eyed, steady, fell into step beside me without a word, then said, "Finally, you've got more in you than you think." I carried that sentence like a medal. On weekends I called home, the home Grace and I had made in our base housing. She told me about preschool, about a girl who wouldn't share the red crayon, about a boy who ate dirt and said it tasted like cookies. When she asked where I was, I said, "I'm learning to be strong." And she said, "Me too," in the voice of a child who believes strength is a color you can choose. By the time I commissioned, I was not the woman on the bus stop bench anymore. I stood in a crisp uniform, my hair pinned back, a small bar on my chest that represented the hours and blisters and tears I'd paid. Grace stood beside me in a blue dress Ivy had found at a yard sale, clapping like the ceremony was just for her. In a way, it was. I sent my mother a photocopy of the commissioning photo with a short note. "I'm safe. We're okay." I didn't send one to my father. I wasn't ready to offer him any piece of my pride. Pride had been costly. I needed to keep it where I could see it. There's something that happens when you survive the impossible long enough. The impossible becomes ordinary. I woke each day with a list and went to bed with a list for tomorrow. The posture became habit. The habit became identity. People started looking to me for answers. I learned to give them. And somewhere in the quiet hours between chow and lights out, I felt a strange peace settle in. The knowledge that the girl my father cast out had learned to command herself. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew this. I would never again be at the mercy of a porch light and a slammed door. I used to think healing would arrive like a trumpet blast. Loud, unmistakable, a banner unfurled that said, "You made it." It didn't. It crept in sideways during ordinary mornings, boots lined up at the door, Grace spreading peanut butter on toast and singing the wrong words to Take me out to the ball game. A stack of field manuals on the table with a grocery list tucked inside. Years have a way of sanding down the sharp edges, and the girl who once stared at a bus stop in December became a woman who could brief a room full of colonels without her voice shaking. My first assignments were the kind nobody writes movies about: logistics, training pipelines, the boring backbone of readiness. But that was my lane, and I ran it. I learned to move people and supplies like chess pieces, to see 3 problems ahead, to say no cleanly when a yes would break the machine. I learned to stare down a whiteboard full of arrows and turn it into a plan. If there's one thing life had taught me since 19, it was that plans save lives. Grace grew like a sapling in a storm and somehow stayed straight. She was the kind of kid who collected library cards from every base we moved to and taped them like badges inside a shoebox. When she was 7, I found a crumpled note in her backpack from school. "Bring your dad to lunch day next Friday." It buckled me for a minute. I wrote the teacher, asked if I could come in uniform. The day I walked into that cafeteria, boots quiet on wax tile, heads turned and then turned back to their pizza squares. Grace took my hand like it was the most normal thing in the world. "This is my mom," she said. No apology, no explanation. The note made it into the shoebox, too. If you're wondering about my parents, the answer is complicated. For years, there was nothing from my father but silence, like a road washed out. My mother learned email at the library and sent me notes about the weather and whether the geraniums had survived the frost. She never asked me for forgiveness. She just wrote like someone trying not to scare off a bird. I sent back pictures: Grace in a thrift store Halloween costume, me in a muddy training field pointing at a map, a cake with too many candles in base housing because a neighbor's boy was turning 4 and his dad was downrange. Ivy, the woman with the casseroles, told me once that love, when it's been dented, sometimes looks like lawn chairs set side by side in silence. You sit, the other person sits. The sitting is the point. My brother Ethan sent a single Christmas card the year Grace turned 10. It was one of those glossy ones with the staged family and matching sweaters at a tree farm. He wrote, "Hope you're well," on the back. No return address. I put it on the mantel and then took it down when it started to bother me. I don't know why I expected more from him. He'd spent our childhood collecting our father's approval like baseball cards, fanning them out for display. Some boys never stopped doing that. I was promoted faster than I expected and slower than I wanted. That's the military for you. It's a clock you don't get to wind. The first time I pinned on Lieutenant Colonel, Grace stood on her tiptoes to reach the pin, her hands shaking. She poked me by accident and gasped. "Sorry, it's good luck," I told her. And we both laughed because we needed to. Later, when everyone had gone and the cake was just crumbs on paper plates, I sat on the floor of our empty quarters and stared at the uniform hanging on the closet door. It felt heavier than fabric. There were hard years, too. I gave a piece of myself to the job that can't be measured on a resume. That's not unique to me. Anyone who served knows the ledger never balances. But it's the kind of cost that doesn't have words you can write in a letter home. Sleeplessness. The weight of decisions that ripple into other families' kitchens. The names you carry in your pocket like stones. If you're reading this as someone over 60, you know what it means to live a life and still feel 20 in one corner of your heart. The body keeps the ledger. So does the soul. By the time Grace was finishing high school, she reminded me of a sailboat that had learned to find wind anywhere. She got a part-time job at the base library and came home with stories of retirees who shelved books by preference, not by Dewey Decimal, and of a widower who kept checking out the same Louis L'Amour paperback like the ending changed, if he asked nicely. Some nights over meatloaf that refused to slice cleanly, she'd tilt her head and ask, "Do you ever want to go back? Back where home?" I'd say what I always said, "I built a new one." Then I changed the subject to her calculus test. It was around then that I learned to make peace with the quiet in my phone. My mother called sometimes, awkward and earnest. Once she told me she'd stood up in Bible study and said out loud that she had failed her daughter. "Nobody said anything," she whispered. "They just passed me the Kleenex." I didn't know how to hold that confession, so I set it down carefully between us and said, "Thank you." It was a small bridge, 2 boards wide. It held. The day the flag officer selection list came out, I didn't jump or cry. I stared at my name, Nicole G., until the words blurred. A 1 star is a strange thing. It's not a medal you can polish. It's a mirror that reflects back every person who helped you stand upright. Oliver with his Post-its and blister tape, Ivy with casseroles, the officer who told me I had more in me than I thought, a teacher who gave me a B+ on a speech because she said my hands wouldn't stop shaking and then stayed late to practice with me until they did. I told Grace first. She screamed and then cried, and then laughed because that's what big news does in a kitchen. With the promotion came a house I didn't expect to live in. Brick and glass, gated, more rooms than we needed. People think the military is all barracks and base housing. Sometimes it's a key handed to you with a stranger saying, "This is yours for now. Steward it well." I hired help because the job would swallow me if I didn't. A housekeeper twice a week and a man named Matthew, who ran the gatehouse and carried himself like a retired referee. He called everyone sir and ma'am, including the golden retriever 2 doors down that greeted him like a long-lost cousin. We didn't call him a butler. He called himself the keeper of lists. He was the kind of man who ironed a tablecloth like he was putting a child to sleep. December rolled around and the world put on its soft lights. We were planning a small reception, soldiers and spouses, a chaplain who told stories better than he preached, a few neighbors who knew to take their boots off without being asked. The invitations were boring on purpose. White cardstock, my name, a date, a time, a request to bring canned goods for the food pantry downtown because the pantry lines get longer when the nights get longer. I watched the stack of RSVPs grow in a silver bowl by the front door and felt the odd hum of contentment. Not pride exactly, more like steadiness. A week before the reception, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't saved, but knew by heart. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, I answered. "Nicole?" My mother's voice, smaller than I remembered. "Hi, Mom." There was a long inhale, the sound a person makes when the words are sharp and they want to soften them on the way out. "Your father he's not well." She rushed on as if to outrun the rest. "He's still stubborn, but he listens to the doctor better than he ever listened to me." I said I was sorry because I was. Illness doesn't erase harm, but it makes everybody human again. She didn't ask for anything, not even to come. She just said, "I've told him about Grace. I've told him about you." The silence after that sentence felt like a porch light flicking on in another universe. "If you ever wanted to see us," she said, "we could come and not stay long. Your brother could drive." I pictured Ethan adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror of a car that smelled like dealership lemon and judgment. I pictured my father gripping the armrest, righteous indignation running low like a battery. I told my mother I would think about it. Then I stood in my kitchen for a very long time, hands flat on the counter, and let 2 decades of anger and mercy circle each other like weary dogs. The truth is, I didn't know which version of myself would answer the door if they came. The one who slept on a bus stop in December. The officer who could take a battlefield of moving parts and make sense of it. The daughter who still sometimes woke at 2,000 a.m. with her heart pounding because a man once said a sentence that felt like a verdict. I made tea because that's what you do when there isn't a clear next step. I set out 2 cups and then put 1 back. I wrote a name on the guest list in small, careful letters. Guest of the General family. Then I crossed it out and rewrote it larger. Matthew would need to know who to let through the gate. People imagine grand decisions happen on stages. More often they happen in kitchens with a pen that doesn't write smoothly. That night I called Grace, who was away at school, and told her grandmother might visit. "Do you want them here?" she asked. Because she is old enough now to know that forgiveness offered to please other people curdles fast. I want a beginning, I said, surprising myself. We can always choose an ending later. She was quiet for a beat, then said, I'll be home for the reception. I can stand next to you. And just like that, the weight shifted a little. The next morning, I found a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was steadier this time. We'll drive down on Saturday, she said. We won't make a fuss. If you change your mind, just don't open the gate. It wasn't manipulation. It was mercy for both of us. Matthew came into my office at the house with his ledger. Ma'am, will you be expecting any special guests? He had a way of making special sound like a quilt someone had mended. I looked at his neat columns and my own name at the top and thought of that bus stop and that porch. Yes, Matthew, I said finally. Please add family. He clicked his pen, wrote carefully, and closed the book like he was tucking in a story for the night. Very good, he said. We'll be ready at the gate. Saturday arrived like a held breath. The house was quieter than usual in the morning, a hush that felt almost ceremonial. I walked the perimeter at dawn, coffee cooling in my hand, checking the little things that people don't notice unless they're wrong. The wreath straight on the front door, the bulbs along the brick path, the flag at the right height and unfaded. Matthew had arranged poinsettias in heavy clay pots and polished the brass on the gatehouse bell until it flashed like a coin. Company ready, he declared, and I nodded like a commanding officer inspecting a formation. I told myself I would work until they arrived. Emails, briefing notes, a schedule for the reception, anything to keep my hands busy. Instead, I found myself in the pantry counting votive candles as if the right number could steady my pulse. Grace texted from the road, 40 minutes out, picked up the cinnamon rolls you like. I answered with a thumbs up and a red heart, then set down my phone because it felt suddenly heavy. By 11, the winter sky had gone that high, pale blue that makes every sound carry. A squirrel scolded from the oaks. Somewhere, a leaf blower droned and stopped. I heard the gate intercom click in the kitchen. 2 beeps, the sound of Matthew's line opening. Ma'am? His voice was low, as if we were in church. They've arrived. I didn't go to the window. I stood where I was and smoothed the front of my sweater as if it had creases I couldn't see. Habit had me check the time, 11:03, and then check myself, shoulders back, chin level, breathe from the diaphragm. It's funny the things that follow you from parade grounds into kitchens. I walked to the foyer and paused by the bowl of RSVPs. The stack had grown fat and festive, names inked in different hands. I picked one up at random, Chaplain Moore and guest, and traced the loops of the capital M with my thumb. The doorbell rang. Not the front door, the gatehouse bell. Matthew has a way of ringing it that is both courteous and insistent. 2 notes that say, "Attention, please," without shouting. I stepped onto the front porch, the boards clean and sun-warmed. From there, I could see down the drive, the ironwork gate open like parted theater curtains, Matthew in his dark suit, ledger under his arm, and beyond him a silver SUV idling with its blinker ticking. Another car waited behind it, rented by the day, the kind with the plastic tag hanging from the mirror. I took the brick steps slowly, hearing the crunch of my own footsteps on the gravel, and stopped by the magnolia, where the shade held a pocket of cool. I didn't want to meet them halfway like a supplicant, or make them walk the full distance like petitioners. Somewhere in the middle felt right. Matthew, precise even at a distance, lifted one hand in a small salute. I could tell he'd already done the mental algebra of tension and kindness, and chosen a setting that wouldn't break either. He opened the SUV's passenger door. My mother unfolded herself from the seat, careful with her purse and with her breath. She wore a wool coat I recognized from a life ago, navy with buttons that had belonged to my grandmother. Her hair was shorter, more silver, her mouth aligned, trying to be a smile. She looked past the yard and the winter bare trees and found me with the certainty of a mother who has always known where to look first. My brother got out on the driver's side, sunglasses too dark for the day, jaw set. He had aged into our father's profile, the ridge of the nose, the habit of standing with feet too far apart like a claim on the ground. He leaned on the door as if it could hold him up inside whatever story he'd brought with him. In the second car, a figure shifted in the back seat. My father then stopped, as if even that motion had taken something from him he didn't want to spend. He did not get out. Matthew glanced at his ledger and then at them, his courtesy like a shield. He gestured to the gatehouse window where a small brass plaque hung. "Guests, please check in." "Good morning," he said. "Are you here to see General Greene?" It was the softest question, delivered like a napkin placed under a glass, and it landed like a gavel. My mother's hand went to her throat. Ethan's glasses slipped lower on his nose as if gravity wanted him to truly see. In the back seat, my father's face turned toward the voice. The words hung in the winter air between them and the fence and the years. For a moment, nobody spoke. You don't realize how loud silence is until you're inside one that big. My mother recovered first. "Yes," she said, speaking not to the gate or the house, or even to me in the distance, but to the universe that had finally rewritten a sentence she'd been afraid to say aloud. "We're here to see our daughter." Matthew inclined his head. "Very good." He stepped back, courtesy clearing a path before anyone knew how to walk it. The gate, obedient to a switch he didn't seem to touch, swung wider. I moved down the drive, the wind lifting the edge of my scarf, and met them where the gravel tightens into pavement. Up close, the years were more obvious on all of us. New lines around eyes, old hurts living under the skin. My mother reached for me and then stopped herself, hands hovering like birds that weren't sure about the perch. I saved her the decision and stepped into her arms, the wool scratchy on my cheek, her perfume still the same drugstore floral that could make a kitchen smell like spring in February. "I'm so sorry," she said into my shoulder, the words small and fierce and late and exactly on time. "I should have gone after you. I should have." She ran out of verbs. I held her tighter for the ones she couldn't find. Over her shoulder, my brother stood awkward and handsome and wrong-footed. "Nicole," he said, the syllables tasting unfamiliar to him. He glanced back at the second car where our father sat, and for once, there was no smirk to borrow, no audience to play. He looked like a boy who had lost his place in a script and didn't know how to admit it. "Ethan," I said. It's remarkable how a name said without weight can set a ceiling on conflict. The back door opened slowly. My father swung his legs out, planted his feet carefully, and rose in small increments like a man accounting for each joint. He had thinned. The authority that used to walk into a room ahead of him no longer did the scouting. He was himself, and he was not. His eyes met mine, the way a man might stare at a horizon that had moved on him when he wasn't looking. He came forward 3 steps and stopped. I saw the calculation, the old rule book in his head, with no entry for approaching a daughter you exiled, who now outranks every story you ever told about yourself. He opened his mouth and closed it. His hands, those hands that had pointed and preached and pounded the kitchen table, were empty. I spoke first because someone had to. "Thank you for coming," I said. The sentence tasted like clean water. No sugar, no poison, just true. My father's mouth worked around a reply. "General," he said, as if trying on a coat that didn't belong to him. Then quieter, "Nicole." It wasn't apology. It was orientation. He had to locate me in the world before he could attempt contrition. Matthew, who can read rooms like maps, offered my mother an arm. "Ma'am," he said, "there's tea inside if you'd like to warm up." My mother's gratitude toward that sentence could have lit the wreath on its own. Ethan nodded at the gatehouse ledger as if numbers could save him. My father looked from the house to me to the ground, landing nowhere long enough to stake a claim. We started up the drive together, with the awkwardness of people who share a history but not a rhythm. The crunch of gravel underfoot kept time. Grace's car turned in then. Cinnamon rolls on the passenger seat, her face bright in a way that made me feel bent and ageless all at once. She parked, hopped out, and read the scene in a single glance, the way children of complicated families learn to do. She walked straight to my mother and said, "Hi, Grandma. I'm Grace." My mother's hand flew to her mouth and then to Grace's cheek as if verifying both existence and warmth. You're beautiful," she managed. "You look just like—" She stopped before saying me, because humility had found her at last. The winter sun had climbed enough to make the brick glow. A neighbor's wind chimes set a soft tinkling that didn't match any melody, but made one anyway. We reached the porch. I held the door open, the wood heavy and familiar in my palm, and my family, careful, chastened, curious, stepped into a house they had imagined as a ruin and found as a refuge. Before I followed them in, I turned back and saw Matthew standing at the gate, ledger tucked against his ribs, proud and protective, and perfectly still. He caught my eye and offered the smallest nod, the kind you give a fellow sentry at the end of a long watch. I returned it. Inside, the heat rose gently from the floor vents, carrying the smell of cinnamon and coffee and something like peace. The day had only begun, and already a sentence that had once been a verdict had been answered by a question at a gate. "Are you here to see General Greene?" Yes. Yes, they were. I didn't plan the afternoon to be a ceremony. It was just a small reception, the kind of thing that fills a house with coats on banisters and the sound of people finding each other in kitchens. But uniforms have a way of making an ordinary room into a witness. I went upstairs to change, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I wanted the truth visible. The jacket lay on the bed, pressed in dark wool, the silver star on my shoulder catching the winter light. Beside it, a small box with Ivy's pearls. I fastened them and thought about the casserole dishes she lined up on my counter that first year, and how mercy is sometimes baked in Pyrex. When I came down the stairs in dress uniform, conversation thinned the way it does when a hymn begins without anyone announcing it. The chaplain straightened. Grace's eyebrows lifted in a private smile that said, "There she is." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and tears sprang up the way they do when a person finally believes what they've been hoping might be true. Ethan stared at the insignia as if the geometry could explain the years between us. My father stood a beat longer than anyone else, chin tipping back, taking in the cut of the cloth. The ribbons he didn't recognize, the deliberate simplicity of a life measured in service and not in speeches. "Lunch is on the dining room," Matthew announced, voice gentle as if he were narrating a truce. People drifted toward ham biscuits and deviled eggs, and a punch bowl glinting like a friendly pond. The chaplain asked if he could say grace. We bowed our heads. In the quiet, I felt my mother's fingers brush the back of my hand like a question she didn't know how to ask. I turned my palm up and let her anchor there. After the amen, Oliver shuffled in on his bad knee with a tin of cookies and a grin big enough to erase a storm. "Gunny," I said, and he saluted me with 2 fingers and a wink, because old Marines reserve the right to be irreverent. He clocked the star on my shoulder, looked pleased, and set his tin next to the cinnamon rolls like coordinates on a map. "Brought the good ones," he said, "the kind sugar forgets to be sorry about." Neighbors came. A young captain from down the street balanced a baby on one hip and a plate on the other. A sergeant major handed Grace an envelope and said, "For the library. Tell them it's for large print westerns." And I thought of her shoebox full of cards. It felt for a few minutes like any December afternoon in a house that had learned the rhythm of that season. Coats off, stories on, the clatter of forks making a kind of music. Then someone rang the bell and the front door opened to a draft of cold air and a wall of white hats. Midshipmen from the Academy's glee club in town for a concert, dropping off canned goods because the chaplain had asked. They filed in, cheeks pink, suddenly aware they had crashed a room full of brass. The senior mid stiffened when he recognized me, barked a crisp "ma'am" that ricocheted off the crown molding. The room paused. I lifted a hand in that small permissive wave that tells a young leader how to be both formal and human. At ease, I said. Put the beans by the pantry, then fix yourself a plate. My father watched them move past him like a river he had forgotten how to read. He glanced at Ethan as if to say, "See?" and then at me as if to ask how. I couldn't give him the decades in a sentence, so I gave him an apple slice from the tray and the possibility of a conversation. People lined up for food. I heard the chaplain telling my mother about the pantry downtown and how the line had doubled since the plant closed. "She keeps it stocked," he said, tilting his head toward me. "Nobody knows how because she doesn't let us brag on her." My mother pressed her lips together. That look she gets when gratitude is too big for her mouth. Ethan drifted close to the mantel, examined the photos like they might betray me, field exercises in the rain, Grace at a science fair with flour on her cheek, me in a hard hat at a groundbreaking for a clinic, a grainy snapshot of the storefront church with folding chairs and a crooked cross. "So," he said, "you really did all this." It wasn't admiration. It wasn't spite. It was inventory. I let the word yes be enough. My father picked up a deviled egg and put it back down. He cleared his throat and tried on the voice he used at church suppers. "Well," he said too loudly, "we all make mistakes. What matters is we—" He paused, searching for a moral he could live with. "We move on." The room heard him. Rooms always do. The chaplain's eyes softened. Oliver set down a cookie. Grace stilled. My mother's fingers tightened on my palm from a minute ago, though we were no longer touching. Old habits resurfaced in my father's face. Control, rewrite, absolve. I felt the past reach for me, and I didn't step into it. I set my plate on the sideboard and turned toward him. "No," I said not unkindly. "We don't just move on, we tell the truth first." Silence rearranged itself. It wasn't the heavy accusatory kind. It was the attentive kind, the way a congregation leans when a testimony is about to matter. "The truth," I continued, "is that you sent me out that night without a coat, and I learned to be warm by making a life that didn't require your permission. The truth is that Mom loved me in emails she typed with 2 fingers. The truth is that Ethan and I turned our backs on each other because it was easier than facing you. The truth is that the poor eat better at the pantry in December, not because you preached about charity, but because this neighborhood shows up with paper bags and humility." My father's mouth opened. Nothing came. He looked down at his hands as if they might have the script written on them. When he lifted his head, the room had set itself around the reality he'd avoided. His daughter in a uniform he had not earned for her, surrounded by a community he did not create. Standing on a floor he did not sweep. He had to choose whether to be small or to be honest. "I was wrong," he said at last, the words shaped like stones but spoken like bread. "I was cruel. I thought I was protecting something that didn't need protecting. Or maybe I was just protecting myself." He swallowed. "I'm sorry." He did not cry. He did not collapse. He stood and told the truth, and that was its own kind of kneeling. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her. Relief and grief braided. She took his hand. The chaplain cleared his throat. "If it's all right," he said, "I'd like to offer a word." He didn't wait for permission so much as ask the room to hold still. There are apologies that come out like PR, and there are apologies that come out like prayer. I heard the second one. He turned to me. "General, would you allow an old preacher to embarrass you for a moment?" He didn't wait for my answer either. "Friends, this woman has funded our pantry for 2 winters and never let me put her name on a bulletin. She set up a scholarship in Ivy's name because casseroles kept a young mother alive. She sent kids to summer camp and bought boots for recruits who didn't own more than a dream. If you want a sermon, you're standing in one." I felt heat rise up my neck, that old discomfort of being named out loud. I shook my head slightly, But he wasn't wrong. Oliver laughed, wiping his eye with a knuckle. "Told you discipline starts where you stand," he said to nobody in particular. Across the room, one of the midshipmen, eager and earnest, put down his plate, and by instinct more than protocol, squared himself to me. Others followed, a ripple of spines straightening. The sergeant major set his coffee on the mantel. People who had never worn a uniform stepped back and quieted, not because anyone ordered them to, but because honor, when you witness it, rearranges your posture. "Please don't," I murmured, because I am suspicious of spectacle. But the moment wasn't about me as much as it was about witness, my mother seeing her daughter honored for the very life she feared had destroyed her. My father seeing a room align itself not to punish him, but to tell the truth he had finally spoken. I took a breath and let the silence crest and fall. "I didn't come back to gloat," I said, voice steady, the line that had been waiting all afternoon. "I came back to see if a family can change." Something in the room exhaled. A Christmas carol floated in from somewhere, some neighbor's speaker bleeding through the cold, and it felt exactly right that the lyric I caught was, "Let every heart prepare him room." I turned to my father. "I don't forget," I said, giving him the dignity of clarity. "But I can forgive." I looked at Ethan. "That goes for brothers who didn't know how to be brothers yet." His jaw worked, and for once he didn't argue with mercy. Grace came to my side and slid her hand into mine, small and strong. "We have cinnamon rolls," she said into the charged quiet, because my daughter knows when to land a plane. Laughter broke the tension in tidy pieces safe to pick up. People moved again. Plates clinked. The midshipmen, mortified by their own reverence, attacked the deviled eggs. My mother touched the star on my shoulder, the way you might touch a relic, and whispered, "You look beautiful." My father nodded once like a man taking off his hat in a sanctuary. The house returned to itself, but something inside it had been repaired. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even justice exactly. It was alignment. A verdict had been answered by a life, and a life had left room for grace. After the plates were stacked, and the last midshipman had bowed himself out with a, "Thank you, ma'am," the house settled into that soft fatigue parties leave behind. Matthew fed platters to the kitchen like a man moving chess pieces after checkmate. The chaplain hugged my mother and slipped out with a promise to send along a hymn list for Christmas Eve. Oliver tapped his bad knee and said he'd see himself out before anyone could object. The sergeant major left the envelope for the library on the sideboard with a note that said, "For Grace's readers, keep the stories moving." I walked my parents and Ethan into the smaller sitting room off the foyer. It's the quietest space in the house. No television, just books and a window that looks onto the magnolia. The winter sun had turned shy, hiding behind a bank of washed wool clouds. Steam drifted from the mugs. Matthew set down peppermint tea for my mother, black coffee for my father, water for Ethan because he looked like a man in a suit trying not to crumple. Grace carried in a plate of cinnamon rolls and left us with the unobtrusive grace of someone who knows families require privacy to change shape. My mother reached for my hand and didn't let go. "I said it in there," she whispered, "but I want to say it again where it can land. I failed you." I shook my head. Not to erase what she needed to confess, but because the word failed felt too simple for what fear does to a person inside a marriage built on rules. "You were afraid," I said. "I was too. The difference is, I had to walk through it." Her fingers tightened. "I was raised to believe a woman's virtue is obedience," she said, voice steady. "I forgot that love sometimes contradicts bad doctrine." Ethan cleared his throat like he was about to propose a motion. "I should have called," he said. He looked at the floor when he said it, which told me he meant it. "I told myself you were better off without the noise. Mostly I told myself what Dad told me." He glanced toward our father and then back at his hands. "That you made your choice." He shrugged. "A boy in a man's jacket. I made mine too. I chose easy. I'm sorry." There was no nuance to offer him. I let the apology sit on the table between us like a gift and said, Thank you. My father didn't speak for a long time. He held the coffee with both hands like a man warming himself by a barrel fire. When he finally looked up, the old pulpit cadence was gone. I thought righteousness required severity, he said. I thought I had to show you the cost of your sin. He closed his eyes once, an old man blinking away an old script. Turns out, I just showed you the cost of mine. He lifted his head. I don't know how to fix what I broke. The sentence didn't tremble. It was sturdier that way. You can't fix it, I said, not unkindly. We can only tell the truth about it and then decide how to live from here. He nodded, absorbing limits like lessons. I want to meet my granddaughter properly, he said. If she'll let me. I could have made him work for that privilege. Could have named a list of conditions as long as the years I'd spent earning my nights. Mercy, when you hoard it, spoils. She already knows your name, I said. She knows the whole story. It belongs to her as much as it does to any of us. Grace must have been leaning in the hall because she appeared then as if summoned by the word granddaughter. She sat across from my father, posture open, the cautious kindness of someone raised to be brave. Hi, she said. I like the way Grandma tells the weather. She uses words like spitting and blustery. My mother laughed through her nose and pressed a napkin to the corner of one eye. My father tried on a smile that didn't quite know where to sit. I used to read the forecast on the local radio, he said, surprising all of us. Your grandma would tell me if I'd said, chance of showers too many times in a week. Grace nodded as if cataloging this soft fact. You're welcome to read our weather anytime, she said. We need more words for snow. We talked like that for a while. Not about the night on the porch, or the years that followed, or the award ceremonies in base housing and the long ledger of absence, but about small ordinary things with weight. The price of eggs, the church potluck schedule, how the library prints free coloring pages on Fridays. It wasn't avoidance, it was scaffolding. Sometimes you have to build a conversation that can hold a heavier roof. When the light folded itself into late afternoon, my mother said we should go before the roads glaze. She stood and hesitated, then did the bravest thing I saw her do all day. She took my father's hand and placed it in mine, a solemn, deliberate transfer of something I couldn't name. Please let us come for Christmas. The words were simple and impossibly large. I didn't answer right away. Every instinct I had honed, the command voice, the triage, the capacity to move a room toward a decision, backed off and let something older speak. Yes, I said, but it will be on my terms. I looked at my father. No speeches, no rewriting. We're going to set one plate at a time and tell one true story at a time. His shoulders dropped. A soldier at ease. Understood, he said. At the door, Ethan paused. Do you remember that game we played in the yard? The one with the chalk lines and the broomstick? Of course I remembered. We were poor enough back then to make baseball out of whatever the garage surrendered. You always hit it over the hedge, he said. I always said you cheated. He swallowed. You didn't. It was as close as he could get to, I admired you, and maybe even, I was scared of how strong you were. We shook hands like men who had just laid down their weapons. They drove away with their blinker ticking and their silence rearranged into something that might, with tending, become peace. Matthew closed the gate and came back to the porch with the day's ledger under his arm. All present and accounted for, he said. I laughed because he was not wrong and because some sentences can be true and tender at once. That night after the dishes, I stood on the back steps with a mug of tea and watched my breath appear and disappear like speech bubbles in a winter comic strip. Grace joined me in a sweatshirt that had migrated from my drawer to hers. How do you feel? She asked. I was honest. Tired, I said. Lighter. She nudged me with her shoulder. I kept thinking, please don't let the story eat my mom. It didn't. You ate it. We stood there letting the moon dilute the darkness. Before bed, I took out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside, the ROTC acceptance letter, A library card from a base long closed, the first picture of me in a uniform that didn't quite fit, a snapshot of Grace at 2 wearing a saucepan like a helmet. I added something new. Today's guest list, family, written in Matthew's tidy hand. You keep records of mercy the way you keep receipts for taxes, because someday you'll need to show the math. On Sunday, I called the pantry director and doubled our December delivery. I wrote a check to the storefront church and asked the pastor to spend it on whatever smelled like Grace in a kitchen. Then I sat at the dining room table and wrote 3 notes. One to my mother, one to Ethan, one to my father. I didn't write metaphors or sermons. I wrote logistics. Arrive at 3. Wear warm coats. Bring one story you're ready to tell true. Grace sealed the envelopes with a flourish like a magician closing a trick. On Christmas Eve, my daughter would give them a gift they could hold in both hands. I hadn't decided yet if it would be a framed photo or a letter folded to fit a pocket, or simply an invitation to sit down without armor. I only knew it would be something a family could hold with both hands. I turned off the lights, the house ticking as it cooled, and stood a minute longer at the window. The magnolia leaves were black coins against the sky. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed. Snow fell. I said a small prayer that sounded mostly like, thank you, and not a little like, help. Then I slept the kind of sleep you earn when you stop rehearsing a wound and start practicing a future. Christmas Eve arrived in a slow hush, as if the whole town had agreed to lower its voice. The sky was the color of pewter, and the air held that crisp, metallic promise that snow might come if we were patient. I woke before the alarm, the way you do on the morning of a day you've been building toward for a long time. Downstairs, the tree lights glowed like small, stubborn stars. Matthew had already set the coffee and lined the mantel with little brown paper bags for the food pantry, each one labeled in his careful block letters. Beans, rice, pasta. Grace patted in, hair in a messy knot, and handed me a mug without a word. We stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the living room fill itself with warmth. Are you ready? She asked. Her voice was gentle, seasonally appropriate. I don't know, I said, telling the truth. But I think we are. We spent the morning like 1,000 other families across this country, checking timers, bickering lightly over oven space, ironing a tablecloth that would wrinkle the minute the first plate was set. I pulled the ham from the oven and listened to it sigh. Grace arranged oranges and peppermint sticks in a bowl, because she likes bowls to look like invitations. I set out the little nativity I've carried from base to base, the one with a chipped camel and a Joseph whose staff is glued on crooked. It's not valuable, but it is ours. At noon I called my mother. We're leaving in 20, she said. Her voice had the bright steadiness of someone who had rehearsed being brave. I thanked her for the warning and texted Matthew. He replied with a thumbs up and a Santa emoji, which from him read like a salute. They arrived at 2:47, early by our family standards, which I decided to consider progress. I heard the gatehouse bell, then the crunch of tires on the drive, then the soft thud of car doors. I stepped onto the porch. My mother's scarf was festive enough to qualify as optimism. Ethan carried a pie like an apology with a lattice top. My father wore his good coat, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and old hymns. Come in, I said, and meant it. Inside, the house did its part. Heat lifted from the floor vents. The tree lights winked. Somewhere in the kitchen, cinnamon announced itself without asking permission. Grace met them at the doorway with 3 small envelopes addressed in her patient looping hand. For later, she said, passing them out. No peeking. We ate early because that's what families do when nerves pretend to be hunger. The ham sliced clean as if it understood the assignment. My mother declared the green beans perfect, and then admitted she liked them better when they were overcooked to a soft surrender the way her mother made them. Ethan took seconds without comment, which I took as a compliment. My father chewed like a man concentrating on a test he had studied for finally. After we cleared plates, Grace stood and cleared her throat with theatrical seriousness. All right, she said. House rules for story time. She held up a finger. 1, no speeches. A second finger. 2, no rewriting. A third. 3, truth. First tenderness, close behind. She looked at me. That's what you said. I smiled at the version of myself reflected back at me, trimmed and softened, but intact. We moved to the sitting room. The magnolia outside was the color of ink, and the first snowflakes began to drift past the glass like lazy confetti. Grace handed out the envelopes. On the count of 3, she said, we opened them together. She counted, we tore, and 3 photographs slid into 3 laps. My commissioning day, 20 years ago, Grace small and stubborn beside me in her blue yard sale dress, my hair pinned back, my smile tentative, but real. My mother's hand went to her heart. Ethan sucked in a breath. My father, God help me. My father reached out with a fingertip and traced the outline of the silver bar on my shoulder in the picture as if touch could travel time. I wish I had been there, he said. The sentence was not a request for absolution. It was an offering shaped like regret. You weren't, I said, because facts are scaffolding. But she was. I nodded at my mother, who had begun to cry the way some people pray, quietly, repetitively, into a tissue that didn't stand a chance. I took her hand. You found words when you could. That counts. We took turns. Ethan told a story about the chalk line baseball game we'd remembered at the door. The day he accused me of cheating because I kept hitting the ball over the hedge to where the neighbor's dog would hide it like treasure. You weren't cheating, he said again, this time with a grin that let the boy out of the man. You were just better. He looked at Grace. Don't tell your mother I said that. My mother told a story I had never heard. How the night I left, she stood in our dark kitchen and pressed her palm to the window over the sink, feeling for my shadow in the yard. I wanted to run after you, she said, voice steady, eyes on the past. I wanted to pick you up and carry you back like a girl who'd fallen off her bike. I didn't because I thought it was godly to stand by my husband. I was wrong about what God required of me. She squeezed my fingers. I am trying to be braver now. My father stared at his hands for a long moment, then lifted his head. I used to think forgiveness was a thing a pastor dispensed out a window like drive-through grace. He said, the ghost of his old cadence softened by new weather. Tonight, I understand it's a table you set every day. It's plates and forks and an honest sentence. He let out a breath. I won't ask you for what I don't deserve, but if you will show me where the plates go, I will set the table. I stood and fetched the plates. He followed me into the kitchen, shoulders squared as if reportable action helped. We set out china together side by side, like people laying a small daily foundation. He placed the forks opposite from where I would have put them, and I left them there, because sometimes forgiveness looks like letting a fork be wrong for an evening. Back in the sitting room, the snow had decided to commit. The flakes thickened, and the street outside went quiet in that way that makes even grown men look out the window like boys. The doorbell rang. Grace looked at me and arched an eyebrow. Right on time, she said. She ran to the foyer and opened the door to the cold. A gust of air and a flurry of white followed her back as she carried in a long, narrow box wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. A simple label in her hand, for Grandma and Grandpa. My mother's hands trembled as she untied the bow. Inside, nested in tissue, lay a framed photo collage, 3 pictures side by side. On the left, a grainy print of me at 19 on that bus stop bench, belly round beneath a too-thin coat, face set against the world. In the middle, my commissioning day. The picture they had just held, resized and brightened. Grace's dress bluer, my smile braver. On the right, a recent photo from our reception last week. Me in uniform, star bright. My mother's fingers on my sleeve. My father's head bowed a fraction in the kind of respect that doesn't need a microphone. Below the photos, Grace had lettered a sentence in ink that bled a little at the curves. Family isn't who never breaks your heart. It's who shows up with glue. My mother made a sound I will carry into old age. My father cleared his throat and then gave up the pretense of composure. Ethan looked at the ceiling, blinking hard, as if the plaster might explain Grace. Grace stood between them, hands folded the way she did when she was little and wanted to be careful with the world. "Thank you," my mother whispered, touching the glass where my 19-year-old face stared back at us with her chin up. "Thank you for not throwing me away when I didn't know how to hold you." My father reached for the frame, then stopped himself, waiting to be invited. I nodded. He took it in both hands like a sacrament. We hung the collage in the hallway where people can't miss it on their way to the bathroom. "That's strategic," Grace said, satisfied. "Everybody visits the truth eventually." We laughed, not because the line was funny, though it was, but because laughter is how relief exits the body when it has been waiting too long. We sang carols after that, badly, earnestly. My father's baritone was rusty but true. My mother found the alto harmony she had abandoned years ago and slipped back into it like a favorite sweater. Ethan and Grace took turns butchering the descant on "O Holy Night," which felt appropriate. Some things are supposed to be a little out of reach. We lit candles and carried them to the porch, watched the snow settle on their paper collars, and listened to our town grow muffled and holy. Before they left, my father paused at the door, hat in hand. "I don't deserve this," he said, gesturing to the warmth of the table, the picture on the wall that told the truth without cruelty. I put my hand on the door jamb the way a woman might touch a mezuzah and said, "None of us does. That's why it's called Christmas." On the porch, we exchanged the hugs of people who have decided to try again. Their taillights disappeared into a white so soft it felt like permission. Matthew closed the gate and returned to the house, snow on his shoulders. He tapped his ledger. "Ma'am," he said, "shall I note that reconciliation is in progress?" I laughed. "Yes," I said, "but put it in pencil. We'll update as we go." Later, when the house was quiet and the tree hummed, Grace handed me a last envelope with my name on it. Inside was a photo of her at 5, wearing a saucepan like a helmet, and saluting me with a wooden spoon. On the back she had written, "Mom, you taught me that strength is making room for someone after they used up their last chance. Merry Christmas." I pressed the picture to my chest, the way I had pressed that acceptance letter years ago, and thought about how love is a ledger that doesn't balance on paper but somehow does in the heart. If you've listened this far, especially if you're old enough to have a box of your own pictures that smell faintly of time, I hope you'll do something simple and hard. Call the person you've been rehearsing an argument with and try rehearsing a welcome instead. Share this story with someone who needs a reason to set one more plate. And if our time together meant something, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and stay. There are more tables to set, more truths to tell, and more ways to choose each other. One ordinary day at a time.